session.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here at Startup Grind with one of my, we don't have favorites as investors, but one of my favorite founders, Alexi from BetterUp. I am Emily Melton. I'm one of the founders of Threshold Ventures. It's an early stage venture capital fund spun out of DFJ. We invest in companies at the earliest stages. So usually post some seed investments at the Series A or Series B when it's early product market fit, but really trying to find entrepreneurs that are looking to change the world and build sustainable long-term companies. Really thrilled to have Alexi here. I'll let you give a little bit of background of yourself, maybe a little of your history and brief overview of BetterUp, and then we can dig in.
Sure. I am Alexi Robichaux. Delighted to be here. We do have favorites as entrepreneurs, and Emily's one of our favorite investors. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of BetterUp, and prior to that was a product executive at VMware. And before that, I went to VMware via the acquisition of SocialCast, where I was fortunate enough to build some of the earliest collaboration tools in, at that time, what was being called the future of work.
So as a early stage investor, one of the things that I have learned over 20 years in the industry is that being a founder is not a rational choice. It is an insanely challenging and lonely journey, what you've chosen to do. So when I'm making an investment, one of the things I focus on is not just the what they're doing, but the why, because the what evolves over time, but the why usually doesn't change. So I'd love to hear why you felt compelled to start BetterUp. What is it that led you on this entrepreneurial journey?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really important question that, often people skip over, and we spent a lot of time thinking about it. I mean, even before I had partnered up with Eddie, who's my amazing co-founder, I spent a lot of time asking, should this be a company, right? For us, it was like, maybe this should be a nonprofit. Maybe we should find a company already doing this and go join them. So it wasn't clear to me that doing a startup or what would become a venture backed startup was the right mechanism for what we wanted to build. And so the why for me was really what we wanted to build, and what we wanted to build had come from my own personal experience, struggling to find care that would live somewhere between what I liked about clinical therapy and what I loved about executive coaching. And neither one really met me where I was at. I wanted the evidence-based rigor and the credibility of therapy, but I didn't have a clinical diagnosis. And I wanted to focus on a strengths-based approach to feel more calibrated, to feel more optimized, and really to actuate more of my potential. And so I knew what I wanted to do was take folks who were trained in these professions and put them on a phone and help millions of people and professionals like myself hopefully live life with greater clarity, purpose, and passion. But that was the first big question of, we want to do that. How should we do that? And so I often say, the first thing we had to answer, Eddie and I were doing after school coaching in a nonprofit with high school students, had a lot of overlaps. And so the first thing we had to really do some soul searching around is this even a for-profit company? And if it's a for-profit company, is this like the traditional lifestyle business, we just do it ourselves? Or is this something where we think it can be big enough that it should be venture-backed and we can get the impact? And for us, it really came down to two considerations. One, we realized, having a decade of experience in the nonprofit world, if we wanted to have the impact we wanted to have, we needed a winning business model. And if we had a winning business model, being a for-profit company was the right way to operationalize that and benefit from the creative potential of capitalism. And then second, we realized we wanted to go fast. We felt, and it's funny to say this in retrospect, we had a huge sense of urgency 8 years ago that if we didn't do it 8 years ago, this was going to be way too late. I think, probably in retrospect, we could have done this a year ago and it still wouldn't have been too late. But we were like, we need speed, we need muzzle velocity was the term we used. And that's what startups and venture capital are great for, right? They can help you grow very fast out of the gate. And so for those reasons, to your point, I mean, that's why we said, hey, we want to impact 1 billion lives. Like, if we're not doing something that can impact 1 billion lives, we feel we failed our mission. And when we thought about how to do that, could we do that as a nonprofit? If you look maybe over 100 years, whereas if you look at what venture can provide and being a startup can provide and technology can provide, it became clear that we could do this in a decade if we really line up our cards right and we're able to operate with excellence.
For those of you that are aspiring founders or entrepreneurs in the audience listening, that kind of definition is really what we look for, because it's not rational. You're doing it anyway. You were doing it in your free time. You wanted to see it happen. It wasn't even necessarily a business thought. It was just some change that you needed to see out in the world, however that could manifest itself. Because that kind of irrational drive is really what is required, we found, to be long-term successful. There's a lot of hype, particularly right now, going through COVID, about coaching solutions, self-help, meditation, and there's a lot of real value that's coming out of that. But there's also an enormous amount of noise. Maybe you could give us just a little bit, like drill down a little bit more to really explain what is BetterUp, what are you grounded in, what's the product and solution that you offer?
Really appreciate the question. A lot of noise. I think, generally we're going through a cultural awakening. I liken this for mental health. I think we're going to the equivalent of the dot-com boom, where this is becoming mainstream, and there's good and bad, right? There's going to be companies that are really positive in that moment, and there's going to be companies, there'll probably be a bunch of web vans, if we're being honest, right? That we don't know what happens to them in human history. But I think that if we just step away from technology for a second and ask what's happening, is I think we've reached a fever pitch, and there's an awareness that in many ways, there's key facets of life and modernity that are unsatisfying. And despite all the economic wealth we've had, despite all the technological internet-based connection we have, the average human, in fact, the average American, has not seen a meaningful increase, and depending on whose research you believe, has actually seen a measurable decrease in subjective well-being, which we know from, the earliest progenitors of psychology, whether it's Henry James, whether it's Abraham Maslow. This is even before clinical psych, right? With Henry James, is the real goal of psychology, the real goal of that field is to help people maximize their potential and be the most flourishing human version of themselves. And so I think latently what we're seeing in society and the world today is this inner struggle to what is purpose in this swirly world we live in? What is performance? How do I really feel like I'm the best version of myself? And traditionally, to your point, that pursuit has been the domain of, on the one hand, religion, right? For millennia, or wisdom traditions, let's say that, philosophy, religion, the wisdom traditions. And in modern times, it's been the domain of the self-help industry. And those are really two hard cliffs to navigate between. You have guru culture on one side, and on the other side, you have guru culture on the other side, right? And so it's really hard to navigate. And we all may come from different wisdom traditions. I'm not making any normative statements about their worth or merits here. But I think we're at the point where for most people, they don't identify in a traditional way with those traditions anymore, nor if they're a millennial or a Gen Z, or even what we find in the days, really any generation today, do they identify with the traditional guru self-help exchange as well. And so people are looking for help. That's what they're looking for. And they need help more than ever, and they don't know where to go. And that was the inspiration for BetterUp. That was my journey. I was watching TED Talks on YouTube because there was nothing else that felt credible, scalable, and accessible in the moment. So when you think about BetterUp, you should really think about BetterUp is the platform for personal growth and professional development. That's always been our aspiration. We built BetterUp to help people, in the really clunky speak of Abraham Maslow, self-actualize. And we realized that work could be a positive platform to do that, because we so much identify our value and self-worth, for right or wrong, with our identity and careers today. And so when we think about BetterUp, we are the world's largest professional coaching solution. And we coach from everything from leadership development to evidence-based sleep and nutrition to new parenting, really anything that facets at that intersection of personal growth and professional development. Our job is to provide the best in science, the best in experience design, and the best in technology to bring that in a really delightful, impactful, and data-rich way to anyone in the world. And so we're really lucky to get to do the work we did. As you shared, Eddie and I were doing this in a super non-scalable way with 16-year-olds after school in Oakland and San Jose for years. So it's fun and fulfilling to be able to do this now with hundreds of thousands of workers around the world.
So the transition from those high school students to what BetterUp is today is serving a lot of the Fortune 500 customers, and that's selling into the CHROs and L&D functions. Why is this the purview of the enterprise? Like, we kind of talked about it, and one of the things that I've hypothesized when we talked is 2008, 2009, the CFO became a really critical figure in the corporation because everyone needed to understand the balance sheet. Everyone was terrified about leverage and interest rates increasing, and that really came out of the financial, challenges that were during that period. The last year, really, the CHRO, the heads of people, have had to tackle something new. We started before that, but suddenly the CHROs aren't just about paying people and benefits. It's how do I make sure my employees are holding it together in this crazy new world? Walk through a little bit of how you think about taking that dream, but positioning it for relevancy within the enterprise.
Yeah, okay, so let me try this. I'll admit my head is a mess. Like I often say, you don't start a company like BetterUp if you have your life figured out. So bear with me here. But I think of this as like a Russian babushka doll. There's three layers of what's going on, I think, at the change that's driving the CHRO becoming the CFO of a decade ago, right? And so what's driving that? Well, the biggest macro change, and Davos has been touting this for 20 years, but it's true and it's becoming real, is we are shifting from profit being the truth of capitalism to a more holistic view of shareholder capitalism. And one of the shareholders, which is getting more representation in that formulation, is the employee, which if you're viewing profit as the truth of business, the employee is a cost center and you don't prioritize the employee experience. In fact, it's expensive. You prioritize the investor experience because that is honest Mildred Freeman capitalism, right? And that doesn't have to be taken to an extreme, right? But I think that's the first doll, right? Well, within that doll, what's happening? Within that doll, what you have is, as part of that, you have this awareness that we're not competing anymore based on pure efficiency of capital, which we were, I would say, up until like 2010. To maybe post 2000 to 2010. Now, the companies that are winning, the Amazons in the world, they're not winning because they have gifted CFOs. They were winning when they had gifted CFOs when you went to business school, Emily. That wasn't that long ago, right? Now they're winning because they have great product people, they have great creatives, and they're winning based on ideas. And they're winning based on ideas that can happen anywhere in the enterprise. In fact, AWS was not invented by Jeff Bezos, the fastest growing company in world history as a sub company. Think about that. The fastest growing company in world history is a sub company of another company, which was started by a frontline engineering manager, Benjamin Black. And they created a culture and environment where somehow his idea made it up to Jeff Bezos to greenlight. That didn't happen in the Jack Welch era. Like, that's just not how companies worked. And so if you believe that we're getting to a more holistic view of capitalism, everyone matters. If you believe in that the companies that really imbue and internalize that are more creative and they're winning on that creative intellectual knowledge contribution, that's the second doll. Then you believe the unit of production is no longer the human body. It's no longer the plant. It's no longer my capital, which is where we just were. It's actually my mind. And if you believe it's my mind and it's my creative abilities and my knowledge, which sadly Peter Drucker was saying 80 years ago at this point, but if we finally are starting to get with it, then whoa, who's one of the most important officers in the C-suite? It's not the guy who makes sure we're spending great money on plant and capital. It's the person, typically a woman, and this day and age, who ensures that we are investing in our unit of means of production, which is all my employees, which incidentally happens to be in all these companies their greatest expenditure of capital. And so I think the third doll, the innermost doll, is companies are waking up to, I'm not competing on what I learned in business school 20 years ago. I'm competing on my Benjamin Blacks. And I don't even know who they are. There's like 1,000 of them. And one of them may start a $1 trillion market cap company within my company. And I have to go find that person. And my CFO is not going to find them. My head of product's not going to find them. It's the CHRO's job to go figure out, how do we create a culture and an operating system as a business that finds those people over time. And then I think you have this COVID thing as a wrecking ball hit that was already happening pre-COVID. And then you have COVID just give everyone the kick in the pants to be like, hey, if you weren't with the program, this is really what matters now.
How does a BetterUp enable a Benjamin Black to meet their fullest potential? And how does that tie back to the CHRO? So how do you, like, I agree with everything you said. This is why it's so much fun talking to you on the theoretical side. Pull it into what specifically you've done to make those connections.
Yeah, so I think two things, right? At a very simple level, there's two sides to that coin if you want to optimize that frontline manager. Which, to your point, we know from that story, that's anecdote, but we know from decades of research, right? Gallup's been doing, everyone's been doing. It's the manager, performance, culture, all this with the frontline manager. So there's two sides. There's the individual side of the frontline manager. What unlocks their potential? Let's say steady state in a vacuum. Well, we know everything from lowering stress and anxiety. When you're stressed and anxious, you actually are not creative neurologically. That's a neuroscientific fact. Fight or flight is the enemy of creativity, right? So necessity is the mother of adventure, invention, but not if you're in a fear state, right? So there's like this delicate balance. We know people who can achieve higher levels of resilience and flow states are more creative and are more likely to bring their greatest creative potentials work. So there's all this individual stuff we can talk about, but individuals live in a context, especially in a company. And so the other side of the equation is, even if you optimize all the individual units, but you don't optimize the system, and you don't give people the ability to orchestrate the system and understand where those pockets of innovation are, they're going to be really rate limited in their contributions. And so through that lens, what BetterUp uniquely does is it negotiates the middle between those. It says, hey, I can personalize in a way that's never been done, finding you the right expert. You want to be a better manager? I got the person. You want to be a better manager while you're being a new parent and you're dealing with the death of a loved one? We can do that. You want to do that while you're also getting relocated? That can be done, right? At the same time, I can aggregate in a safe way for the employer, for that CHRO, and say, hey, here are the themes that are empirically being worked on in your workforce that your teams are actually struggling with. This is completely different often from what they're telling you in their engagement surveys. This is based on hundreds of thousands of hours of conversation, interaction, personal reporting, observed progress by experts, and aggregate it up. And so you're giving the person the ability to change. You're giving that frontline manager, let me coach you on how to present that idea, how to pitch that, how to unblock your thinking. And then you're giving the organization the insight to say, you have a lot of highly creative people who are not in positions where they're most leveraged to impact that. And we find that all the time. We go to CHROs and we're like, give us the list of your high potentials, your 9-box from Workday or SAP, whatever you use. And we look at those psychographically based on our data. And what we find is you don't have the people who actually are psychologically even want to manage being groomed for management. You didn't even ask them if they wanted to be a management. You just took the top performers and assumed they wanted to lead, but it turns out, especially in technical fields, they often don't. And so that's just a simple explanation of how that data spectrum allows companies previously unfathomed insight into their human capital and their people, their greatest asset, while also creating a really powerful experience if you're that frontline manager.
Well, we've talked about this. I mean, it's really fascinating, particularly with the knowledge workforce, that the largest expense is your people. And yet oftentimes you hire them, you retain them, you put them into a workday, but you don't really understand. You're not optimizing that expense, right? And we've gone through marketing where you spend 50% of the dollars, you don't know why. And suddenly now we can track everything down,
that's right,
specifically to every dollar in marketing. How do we do that with our human capital? It's a real tension of optimizing human flourishing and the individual and the whole person to thinking about being in a company, right? And when I was growing up, you would have never thought, like, you worked 9 to 5 and then what happened outside of that happened outside of it. And now those lines are being really blurred. What are the traits you see of the CHROs who get this? Like, how, when you're talking about that whole person, and maybe COVID has even broken that down more because we're literally calling from our homes with our kids in the background. But pre-COVID, who understood that whole person? Are you seeing, people becoming more aware that they need to actually recognize that these aren't just their workers, but their moms, their parents, their spouses, everything else?
It's really cool in that, like, it's really, we always say it was frustrating to create our sales process about this, I'll tell you that, but it's psychographic, right? And maybe that's like, duh, we're talking about psychology. It's really about the mindset of the person. What we find is these progressive CHROs come from different walks, right? Some of them come from, hey, I've been in HR my career. I'm a psychology geek. I'm a people science geek. I love Peter Drucker. I've always got it. I've been trying to convince my line of business peers for 3 decades this is the case. Some we find come from athleticism. That's a common path where it's like, I totally get this because I was an athlete and I know, like, my on the field performance on whatever sport that is, if I was having issues on the home front, impact that. And so, like, this idea that these would be separate is just silly. It's a silly business, and it's anachronistic. Others we find come from the military. The military actually has some of the most enlightened views on the integration. They don't have a concept of, like, they have battlefield fitness, but they don't have a concept of, like, a soldier's home life being separate from, like, how they show up, right? For them, it's one continuous spectrum, and they invest in it all because they realize lives are won and lost and saved when someone's optimized. And so what we found the key mindsets is, first, I think it's an understanding that there's one human. You're a human being first. And when you come into the workplace, you're imbuing a role and you're not giving up that humanity. And then 2, I actually think there's a radical type of thinking where it's very just matter of fact of, like, sure, we can sit here all day and argue that we shouldn't have to do it. But what I find with a lot of these CHROs, they're just very pragmatic. And they're just like, if we want to win and we want the best people in the world, I'm not in the realm of what we should and shouldn't have to do as a company. I'm in the realm of what works. And, like, the science tells me, our own personal experience tells me this works. What is the enemy, I think, is the interesting one. Why doesn't every company do this? I've had some great conversations with folks like Fred Kaufman on our science board around. Ego is the enemy. The enemy is like the guy who worked for 40 years and didn't have this and is like, well, I had to work my way up and no one let me do that. And like, if I had to do it, you had to do it. That same mindset we know is called a fixed mindset from Carol Dweck is also the enemy of all innovation. So like what you actually find to these folks' credit is they're open-minded, they have a growth-oriented mindset, and they don't care about themselves. They care about what works and the job before them. And strangely, that is incredibly rare in corporate America. And I think with COVID, it's becoming more rare because more people are in that boat and like, I'm viscerally living this now. And so I get it. But before, to the CHROs, whether they're working with BetterUp or other companies in the same slipstream, it's a huge credit to, they haven't been structurally empowered for the most part. And they have been the lone voice in the wilderness who is like, if we want to win, I keep telling you all, we're going to win by really honoring the humanity of our people and investing in them as whole persons. And that's not woo-woo, right? Like the NFL does that, the military does that, the Navy SEALs do that, the Olympians do that. Like if you say like, oh, that sounds like some crazy woo-woo stuff from Silicon Valley, Alexi, it's not, right? Like the toughest people on earth live by this. What's weird is that in business, we somehow think that the Navy SEALs aren't better than this, Sheryl Sandberg's not better than this, Serena Williams not better than this, no actor or celebrity performer is better than this, but as like a director at a Fortune 500 company, I'm better than this. That's the weird part.
We talked when I was making the investment in BetterUp, that was the one thing, is this just a Silicon Valley? I don't know if I use woohoo as how do you make sure can you actually get people outside of San Francisco to purchase this? And our customer base is very diverse. I mean, you have
they're mainly out there. Yeah, they get it better. Yeah.
How do you, one of the things to say is like, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it or invest in it. So let's talk about the ROI. Like what are other than, saying human flourishing and empowerment, that sounds wonderful, but then how do you give the metrics back to the CHRO or the heads of people to empower them to tell the rest of the organization that this is working?
Yeah, I mean, measurement's huge. And I think to the team's credit, like if we've been fortunate to invent a lot of things at BetterUp, but one thing they invented early on, as you know, which I think really buoyed the business, was the system of measurement that didn't exist in the category. And that's become the category defining system now. And so, we think of it as your social emotional DNA. That's essentially what we've devised. It's called our whole person model. And it is, we work with folks like Adam Grant at Wharton, Martin Seligman at UPenn, some of the leading social psych and occupational psychologists in the world to develop this. And it's essentially 26 different evidence-based mindset skills, behaviors, and outcomes that we know drive job performance and life performance. And everything on BetterUp is essentially a giant machine that is compiling down to assembly. And assembly for us is whole person model. And so from everything we do, from how our coaches are coaching to how the software is sizing you up to personalize and figure out what you need, it is all going back to this data model. And that allows us to give such expressive outputs to enterprises that they've never seen. And so, for example, now we can go to companies and say things like, hey, what we're finding is sales teams whose managers have this type of support, they're outperforming their peers by 20% in revenue creation. That's tens of millions of dollars a quarter, right? Like that's never existed. A CHRO has never been able to say like, yeah, I mean, higher engagement drove this revenue. No, it's just like this general truism that like, if people are more engaged, we'll be more productive. But to be able to say like, look, we've done the studies, we've done the correlation, we've controlled for this, and we can do this with the combination of the science and the technology and actually say, this is the dollar ROI of what you've returned based on investing in this group. That's huge. And that's breathtaking. And I think to your point, if you rewind to marketing, not that long ago, I started my career at the Walt Disney Company. And we used to joke, I was in finance. We joke like, what are these marketing people spending money on? Like, how do you know that billboard worked? They didn't know. It's Disney. They just spend billions of dollars in marketing. Now they start to know with more digital. And so we're at this stage where we're getting from loose attribution, Nielsen would be the analogy in HR, to actual digital, multi-touch attribution that Disney Plus is using. Right. And that's what's happening in HR. And it's been really fun to be part of that software and the technology piece that makes that attribution possible for the first time.
It makes me so excited because as a professional, but as a mother, and like I have all these identities and you feel like you have to separate these identities. I'm a venture capitalist, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, but really being able to tie those together and having that overall be performance, I think would enable me to be more successful in my career. And I wish I had this a decade ago. And as I think about the opportunity of BetterUp being able to invest in how to help people be their best selves across all the different components, tying that specifically to an outcome that is monetary, that a company can recognize, like that not only helps capitalism, that helps society. DEI is a big thing where you're getting pulled in as a company because of this. So maybe talk not just like how it's not just about the, that ROI, but how you've been able to empower organizations to recognize that those, having people recognize their whole person and the diversity of that whole person can be empowered to help them drive better results.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. It's something we care deeply about. I mean, you know this, Emily. It's been in our DNA from day one, and it is something that we had off solutions pre-pandemic about, focused on this. And I would say, like, I think a fair description, and I can synthesize from conversations beyond me with CHROs and analysts about this too, is pre-pandemic, many companies had a chief diversity officer, and there was some attention paid to that. But that person typically didn't actually have a lot of fungible budget to actually fund initiatives. And I think what we've seen post-pandemic in a positive sense is, and really, I think it's less the pandemic than the coinciding George Floyd incidents and the awareness around the racial injustice in our country. But they did, as a lived experience, very much intersect and mix together. Is they've been more empowered structurally from a budget standpoint. If you're these folks, right, these CHR, chief equity and diversity officers. And so what we know from the research is two things. We know that the past 20 years of DEI initiatives have essentially not moved the needle. That's been pretty conclusively from Robin Ely at Harvard, who's on our science board, to Quinetta Robertson, who's on our science board, to a lot of scientists and researchers and professors have shown.
What we've historically done has not worked, period.
Yes. And why? This is the second thing we know. What we know why is that this stuff is really hard. Like, you're dealing with people's sense of self. You're dealing with deep held prejudices that are both conscious and unconscious, bias. And you're dealing with their own identity and their relationship to others. And the idea that you can go to a workshop and make meaningful progress on that, when you think about how deeply seated some of this is, it's not laughable, but it would be awesome if that was the case. It turns out that's not the case from what we find. And so I think the second thing we're seeing is there's a new renaissance and a new understanding of, we need some deeper, more perceptive tools and solutions that play at the realm where this exists. And we've been tackling the behaviors extrinsically. What we haven't been tackling is the drivers of those behaviors. And that takes coaching or therapy. That is not something you do in a 6-hour seminar. That is something you need to be in a very safe space. You need to be able to have vulnerable conversations, and you need to be exposed to other people's experiences. And so what we found is what the research is starting to put forward and see as the winning formula is a combination of group-based interventions. So we call them coaching circles, group coaching, where you are in a diverse group. If you just have 7 white dudes like me talking about being more diverse and equitable leaders, you may make some progress, but it's going to be way better if Eddie, who's my co-founder and is from Peru's, in there and can tell us what we don't know based on our lived experience, right? And then you still need that reinforced by the one-on-one coaching. And this, to me, is still the amazing part that, like, most of the industry has missed, is you can't just go to the highly scalable group, smaller workshop, great. You still need the one-on-one space so people can come out of that. They can have the safe space to reflect and learn. And so we've created a solution around that. And to your point, it's selling literally like hotcakes. We sold $1 million of this in its first day on the market. It's kind of like our fastest product flying off the shelf. We're seeing crazy adoption, and that, like, these cohorts typically go for 8 to 10 weeks, and we have 80% completion, meaning that if on day one of who's in those groups, like 8 out of those 10 people are still there at the last week, which in any enterprise experience, even in a consumer experience, I mean, no one has that, right? And so it's been really cool to see that reinforcement of the group, where I'm learning vicariously through others. I'm getting exposed in a safe space to the limits of my own personal experience and being invited into someone else's shoes. Then the ability to digest, process, and masticate on that with a coach in a really safe environment is creating a cool feedback loop.
One of the things gets me so excited about our coaching circles, in particular around these initiatives, is they aren't interventions, one-off interventions. They're systemic change in organization. And I know we're early on in that, but we do have this data that it is sustained. And so the ability to sustain that and then capture that change over time, because that's what we need. We've seen a lot of these one-off good intention attempts, but not true systemic long-term change. Changing directions a little bit. One of the things we've, it's again, kind of going back to this coaching and concept of mental fitness and mental health. A lot of what I do as an investor is in the healthcare arena, which is really, unfortunately, our healthcare ecosystem is completely driven by interventions, right? We wait till people get sick and we spend tons of money once they're sick versus spending some money on time to prevent the disease. And Alexi knows this. One of the things I got so excited about in the investment in BetterUp was I thought it was one of the few times that incentives were aligned to actually do prevention and management of mental health, mental fitness, because they're the knowledge workers. You want to invest before they're facing anxiety, stress, burnout. And that's even more the case now in COVID than it was when I originally made the investment many years ago.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about the spectrum of mental health and mental fitness and how you see it, and specifically resiliency, how you see that playing, in the cohorts that were existing pre-COVID and how they've maybe sustained or been successful during COVID because of that experience.
Yeah, so I mean, one theory of innovation is that, you have these scientific, right? This is like Thomas Kuhn's, you have these scientific changes and paradigms, and eventually that percolates through an ecosystem that includes entrepreneurs and becomes mass market, right? So you can look at you can look at Robinhood for this, right? Where did that start? This started with economists figuring out that, hey, there could be this concept of like an index fund. And if we did that, then that would be better. Then Vanguard was built in that insight. And then eventually even the Vanguards was like, well, only the rich can afford that. Let's make this really accessible to everyone. And eventually you end up with Robinhood, right? Where it's like free to invest. And so you can see this pipeline from it often starts with the university figuring out or changing the paradigm. So that is what's actually been happening for the past 50 years in psychology and in all these ensuing interventions. Mental health care is a child of clinical psychology. But the real paradigm shift is with Martin Seligman, Chuck Mihai at Claremont, Abraham Maslow before that, who actually ended his life in Menlo Park studying the workplace as his final act, was that, hey, we only have the fixed mental illness part of the spectrum. That would be like only having ambulatory care or emergency rooms in physical health. And we don't have the positive side, which is like, you can go to the gym and get yoked. And if you get worked out and you like build an immune system physically, you won't go to the emergency room as much. And so there has been it happened 30 years ago, a big change in the scientific community around rethinking mental health as a spectrum that goes from -1. So maybe someone who does have a clinical diagnosis, from schizophrenia on one extreme end to maybe like just generalized anxiety that's a little less acute, right? Or acutive. And then that gets you to 0 to 1. Now, what this scientific revolution says with positive psychology is that's -0 to 1, -1 to 0. What about 0 to infinity? We don't know the upper limit of that. That whole thing is actually mental health. And so when I say mental health, that's what I mean. And so where we are with BetterUp is we are creating index funds based on the science. We're basically saying, you're right, no one's operationalized the 0 to infinity part of human flourishing. How great can humans be? We don't know. And most of the lineage of psychology and ensuing healthcare has been focused on, as Freud would say, just being as miserable as everyone else, right? Like, let's get you out of an acute state and just get you evenly miserable with the rest of us. So and that's not what Viktor Frankl would say, right? Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, would say, no, like that can't be the goal. I was in a concentration camp and I still wanted to have a profound sense of meaning. And so Professor Seligman says, yeah, it's not about just removing mental illness. It's about building positive mental health, building vigor, building strength, building performance. Just like an athlete is healthier than me, almost any professional athlete is healthier than me, right? And so that's what we really are excited to be part of the scientific revolution with BetterUp and say, what we're doing is taking now 3 decades of science that hasn't gone mainstream. If you ask the average American what's mental health, they're going to say it's about crazy people, right? In some way. But what they should say is, when I say, what is health, physical health, they don't say it's about not going to the doctor. They say it's about being really fit and like lean and eating healthy and exercising and Nike and working out. Where's Nike for work? Where's Nike for mental health? Where's the prevention layer that says I can build proactively? And what we know scientifically, you know this better than anyone, Emily, when you do that, you reduce the onset of clinical mental illness, right? And I think that's the big opportunity for society, is in this COVID moment, there will be an ensuing mental health crisis unless we change our frame. The idea that we should come out of COVID and just therapize the world is misleading. It's not scalable. We don't have enough therapists. And it's also not what people need. It's what a small percent of the population needs. And I've benefited from therapy. I've been there. But to your point, most people need therapy at an episodic moment in their life. They don't need it forever. What they need forever is coaching centered on human potential, self-actualization, and these positive components of evidence-based psychology related to meaning, purpose, and strengths. And that is where we are really glad to pick up the baton as BetterUp and say, we want to create the brand, we want to create the place to do that and to be your partner for your lifelong journey on that.
You know, I'm thrilled that we've had the destigmatization of mental health. And I think mental illness is part of this COVID, and people seeking it and admitting that they're seeking help when they need help and different kind of interventions. But on the flip side, I am concerned. We've seen a massive increase of prescriptions, particularly around anxiety and others. And it's a very US healthcare system way, which is just, there's a pill for that. Let's just try to fix it. But as we've seen with obesity epidemics, like modern health is not helping us get thinner. We need to actually focus on nutrition. We need to focus on sleep. There's this complexity of how do you actually, rewire the human body for the stresses of our current environment to be able to still, flourish and thrive. And before I met you, the reason we geeked out was I had went through my own challenges professionally and personally. And I love that you get to call him Marty. The Seligman's books were a huge piece of it for me now, having got to meet him, seeing that and going through that own transformation. But it was it was research-based. It wasn't something that was actually available to everyone. I know we only have a couple of minutes left. The last question I have is that, you're in there talking to the Fortune 500, Fortune 100 customers who are transforming their workforces, but you're also a CEO and founder in your own right with your own company and your own organization. And it's got to have a lot of pressure to eat the dog food in the sense that you have to not only be able to provide these solutions, but build an organization which is authentic and consistent with the values. What has that journey been like for you? What are some of the things that you've learned about building a culture and organization from the scratch that actually embodies the values of BetterUp?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is that we're always arriving. We're never there. And I think, we built a great business, as you know, better than anyone. We built a great company, but I actually think what underpins all of that, and I didn't even think of this when we started BetterUp, right? But we built a great community of what we say are pilgrims, people who are authentically on the path themselves and going through the motions like you did, like I did, like I'm still doing, right? Still working with the same coach after 7 years, right? Going through the motions. And I think what that's created is functionally a community of practice where everyone is on this journey and this adventure in themselves. And that creates a ton of empathy, that creates a ton of compassion because we're all in it together. And we all know the frustration of what it's like to reflect and realize you fell short of your aspiration or who you want to be or the value you uphold. And that's good. That creates a developmental calculus where you're like, my behaviors are here. What I espouse is here. I want to close that. And it works when everyone has that. And then you don't get this judgmental culture because everyone's like, yeah, I literally did that yesterday, right? So I totally know what it's like. And so I think what we've really done as a community is make a safe place for practice, right? Create a practice field where work is a platform to do this. And I think one way we've done that is with our early understanding that we wanted to be authentic. And being authentic isn't being perfect. Being authentic is sometimes being very vulnerable. It's sometimes being very open, but it's also being very intentional and explicit. And if you're just the first without the second, I'd say you're a mess, right? If you have to, as a founder, as a CEO, you have to be explicit. We're explicit about our values. We're also explicit that we aren't fully achieving our values every day. And that with every successive hire we make, with every behavior we do, we hope to close the gap between our culture, which is not aspirational, it's descriptive of where we are today as the sum total of our behaviors, to our values. And that we're all on this developmental calculus together. We all are somewhere in this journey. And that should create a space of compassion and understanding, but it should also create a space of spurring one another forward to win the prize and try to enact the values more beautifully and with more fidelity. And that is not where I started my career. We don't need to say the company, but that was not the mindset. Right? The mindset was just if this isn't working out for you, you don't have to be here, right? And it was most companies don't think that way. And I think it's something that Eddie and I, were fortunate to work at some of the great companies, and we were this still feels off to me. And so We're not perfect, like I said. And I think the biggest thing you do as the founder is just be honest about that. Here's our problems, here's our warts, here's where we're not perfect, here's where we want to be, here's where we're investing in that, and here's how we're holding ourselves accountable. And we invite you to do the same. In fact, that process is BetterUp. That's our culture. Our culture is being acceptable in that process, doing that accountability, and encouraging one another to participate. If you make your culture that process, I think you win.
I think we just finished. I don't know if
Great.
to continue that, but that was perfect. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Thanks for the opportunity.